Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory, where hearty discussion of all things TV draws a smart circle around lessons of leadership, persistence, and achievement. Every time you tune in, you'll find fresh perspective and dots that are connected to reveal just how powerful TV is to women and how important it is that we're represented. I bring this to you from my vantage point as a public relations and marketing consultant, as an adjunct professor, and as a lifelong student of TV. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Oh wait, find this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Radio Public, Libsyn, Google Play, and Auto Radio. Engage with us on Twitter. Our handle is @TVHerstory. Okay, on with the show. Welcome, TV Herstorians. We are in for a fascinating discussion this afternoon because I am on the campus of the beautiful University of Michigan, Go Big Blue, here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I'm seated in the very snazzy academic administrator's office of Dr. Robin Means Coleman. And in addition to having like 1,000 thank you cards from all of her loving and adoring students, she seems to be like on a first name basis with a certain former FLOTUS, and there's a handwritten note. So I am in the presence of greatness, not only to talk about all things women and TV, but in particular to talk about A Different World, and the fact that it became the show it did because of almost a bit of a fluke, but it was an understood observation that a few people made and took out Ann Bates and replaced her with Debbie Allen, and we know now what Debbie Allen has become. So Dr. Robin Means Coleman, whose title is currently, what's your title?
I have so many titles. So I am an Associate Dean of Social Sciences here in the Rackham Graduate School. I am a Professor of Communication Studies, and I'm a Professor of Afro-American and African Studies. So Michigan's keeping me really busy.
It sounds like they are, and these students are very, very lucky to have you. So you largely teach graduate students then?
No, I teach undergraduates and graduate students.
Excellent. They're lucky to have you, and Advanced TV Herstory is thrilled to be here to talk about this important topic with you. A Different World is one of those shows that I really felt I could not begin even taking a layer off of until I had found the appropriate content experts or those with firsthand knowledge who actually contributed to the show. So we're just going to take a little slice of the Different World pie today, and it starts off with actually an essay that Robin had written for a collection of essays it's a book called Watching While Black. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your background and how it is that you became this important contributor to the University of Michigan. How did you end up in media studies and film and TV?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not one I was expecting, but I think the answer I'm going to go with today is that there were few people doing research into Black media as when I was an undergraduate student, and I really had a passion for it. And I think as undergrads, we have these return on investment narratives. And so that means that you go into business or law, and it's a skills-based conversation. And I'm really thankful that my parents understood the value of the humanities, the value of the social sciences, and allowed me to explore questions that were really underexplored. Like, well, what's up with these representations on television? And how come there's not a lot of people who look like me? And so that was the start of the interest.
And would you say that then is an underlying theme of the classes that you teach and the conversations you have with students?
Absolutely. And it really is about representation and inclusion and issues of affect with an A, about how we feel about what we see on television. I try to stay away from the here's a stereotype, there's a stereotype narrative, although inevitably that's what comes up in some of the shows that we talk about, specifically Black situation comedies.
Wow. And your undergraduate degree was in?
My degrees are in communication.
All right.
Communications and mass communication.
Couldn't get enough of it, huh?
I loved it.
Well, thank you again for taking some time out of your busy day for us to talk about A Different World. And is every advanced TV historian has to have a soft spot in their heart for A Different World. Oh, what a cast and what a series it was. And we're going to talk about specifically that period of time after the first season, but we need to set up the first season.
There is a God. Hi. My name is Earl. No, that's not it. It's not even close. It's something with a D. My name is Dwayne. Dwayne is my name.
Dwayne. Hi, my name is Denise, and this is my luggage.
Oh, well, let me help you with that. I could just kick myself for not thinking of this earlier.
This time with no respect, get out.
Okay.
Out.
I'm going to Denise. It's my pleasure. I'll see you.
What was that?
That's one of the things that's going to make my job more difficult. Hi, I'm Stevie Rawlins, dorm director.
Oh, hi.
Welcome to Gilbert.
Thanks. It's so nice to be in this dorm. You know, compared to freshman dorms, this place is like paradise. Oh, I'm Denise Huxtable.
Oh, it's so nice to meet you, and don't lose that enthusiasm. You're going to need it.
You know, my mom used to live in this dorm. And my dad used to live on those steps.
Well, times haven't changed. Let's see, Huxtable. Huxtable, you're in 20Y with, Jaleesa Vincent. And I think she's here already.
Oh, great. I can't wait to meet her. Thanks, Mrs. Rawlins.
The name is Stevie.
Thanks, Stevie.
Oh, Stevie, we never saw much more of you as the series stretched on. And we only saw Lisa Bonet, the spin-off character from The Cosby Show, for one season. A Different World was intended to transition Bonet's Denise Huxtable into a college co-ed. This was her chance. This was her career. It could have set her. Like her Huxtable family, Bonet did not have a lengthy resume prior to landing her role on The Cosby Show in 1982. But she was a breakthrough for that show in the first 4 seasons. So A Different World premiered on September 24th, 1987, and it ran until 1993. And Bonet was just 19 years old when it premiered, but 2 months later, on her 20th birthday, she eloped with Lenny Kravitz. Yes, Lenny Kravitz. Now, by the time the series was being considered for renewal in the spring of 1988, Bonet announced that she was pregnant with Zoe Kravitz. Some thought it would be realistic to have the series continue and to make Bonet's pregnancy Denise's as well. That would certainly send A Different World into a different direction, but still, it's real, right? But Team Cosby thought differently, and so the series renewed for a second season, and it had an opportunity to reposition itself, this time without Bonet. And that's exactly what Debbie Allen did as its new producer. Your essay really deconstructs almost, you read Debbie Allen's mind 10 years or 15 years later from when she decided these changes needed to happen. So tell us a little bit about what that all meant.
So where I think we should start was this moment of whether Debbie Allen comes on to A Different World and whether it's a fluke. And there's a really interesting story behind that, where in some ways it is a bit accidental and also incredibly intentional. And what's happening is Ann Bates is directing the first season of A Different World, and there's this wonderful crossover episode between A Different World and The Cosby Show, which, as you know, A Different World is the spinoff. And Phylicia Rashad, who played Claire Huxtable, goes on to the set of A Different World, and she concludes that it's just disastrous. The cast is beleaguered, and they're sitting and they're just waiting for the show to get canceled. There's chaos on the set. The quality of the scripts aren't up to snuff. It's certainly not the kind of legacy show that you would see from the quality of a Cosby Show. And so Phylicia Rashad goes back to Bill Cosby, who had, sort of decided to, I'm not going to loom large over the show. I am going to let the show develop its own legs. And she said, look, your name is on this. You really should know what's happening over there. And so that's the start of Phylicia Rashad's sister Debbie Allen taking over the series.
Who, at that point in time, had completed a very successful, though kind of low-key run of Fame. Fame, you cannot see. The TV show has never been rerun, or at least not in this century. The movie is almost forgotten. And that's really kind of sad, because I remember that was a very inspiring movie.
Fame is fabulous, and it made so many careers.
It did.
And, I think there's still just hundreds of thousands of people who can still walk around and say, you want fame? Well, fame costs. And here's where you pay for it, in sweat or something like that. Sorry, Debbie.
No, that was perfect.
So, but what happens is, I think what's interesting about what happens with A Different World is that notion of chaos that Felicia Rashad picked up on. For those who know Ann Bates's career, that refrain of chaos would sound really quite familiar.
Square pegs.
Square pegs. So Anne has Square Pegs from 1982 to 1983. It has two claims of fame. The first is that it launches the career of Sarah Jessica Parker. Its second claim to fame is its infamy. And that is sort of brought out in an interesting way through TV Guide, who says there was this show that was interesting, it had interesting actors, and it had great potential, but its talent wasn't cultivated. There was chaos on the set. There's that chaos. And so they dig deeper, and they find quite a few scandals related to Square Pegs. Drug scandals, sexual impropriety scandals, just a lot of havoc that's on this set.
And she had risen up to Square Pegs from Saturday Night Live. So it is interesting that she had the opportunity, and even with a different caliber of cast and presumably writers, that it was just not a task that she was up to. Now, I must pause for a minute to say that Ann Bates, on her own merit, should be inducted into the Advanced TV Herstory Hall of Fame. She should not simply have her reputation rest on one season of A Different World and one season of Square Pegs, because she is indeed an unsung pioneer. As a comedy writer, her star rose quickly in the early 70s. Through her work with the National Lampoon and later Saturday Night Live. So, in reality, Bates is in fact a gifted sketch comedy writer whose real success came in creating the edgy, political, satiric tone which has become the hallmark of Saturday Night Live. And think about the dozens of major comedy careers that have sprung from Saturday Night Live. But you have to ask yourself, why was she even first selected to produce Square Pegs and later A Different World? Was it so much that these shows were considered right up her alley? Or maybe that they felt that because they were about young people and filled with casts of unknowns, that there was little risk in entrusting them to a woman? Maybe they knew they had to get done, but no man wanted to do them. I don't know. And it just seems like such a poor fit. And maybe that's it. Maybe I'm being overly cynical, and I guess I'm doing so with the benefit of hindsight. But the fit doesn't look good for either show from the outset. But rest assured, listeners, Advanced TV Herstory will invite Ms. Bates for an interview and get to the bottom of the story of what it was like, really the foundation of her career, and that it was what it was to be like to be the only woman in the comedy writer's room back in the 70s. We fast forward. Felicia Rashad makes her appearance. Bill Cosby tips the scale toward Debbie Allen, welcomes her aboard at the helm with, it seems like, a lot of creative control. And so in this transition where the show survived from season 1 to season 2, help us understand from a cosmic perspective why it was so important to right all of those wrongs fairly quickly and establish what ultimately was Debbie Allen's vision for the show.
Sure.
Why was it important?
So this is Debbie Allen coming on to A Different World. It's not exactly nepotism, and though they're sisters, Debbie Allen comes with an incredible resume. She has producer, writer, and director credits already under her belt. She's done about 24 TV specials. She's choreographed the Tonys, the Golden Globes, the Academy Awards. So she is a really well-known, award-winning sort of television behind the camera executive. So this is somebody who's really quite talented. The other thing that Debbie Allen brings to A Different World is herself. In the same way that Anne Bates brought herself to Square Pegs, because Square Pegs was loosely based on her experiences in high school, Debbie Allen's bringing to A Different World her experiences at a historically black college or university, HBCUs as we call them. And so bringing Debbie Allen in means that right away we have got to turn A Different World. Its setting is a historically black college, and so we've got to turn it into a historically black college story right away. That's the most important thing that needs to happen, and there's no one better to do this than Debbie Allen, because she actually is a graduate of an HBCU.
Howard University, yes. So she took the set and she changed the set, is that correct? She played around with the members of the cast in order to make it more relatable and more authentic. And then we also find that her storytelling really advances forward, and the show becomes much more socially relevant and socially sophisticated, I'm going to say. Let's transition to talk a little bit about just some of the adjustments she made visually, musically, because you mentioned them in your essay, and they are it's just masterful when you add up all these small tactics, these small transitions, and they seemed very fluid. I don't think anybody really complained that the show somehow got better and they missed the way it had been.
Yeah. And this was, again, very intentional on Debbie Allen's part. And the first thing that she does, which she gets right, is she creates this Bible for the series. And so there's a researcher, Vanita Kelly, who was actually able to get some time on the set. And she is given access to A Different World Bible. And so Professor Kelly talks about how Debbie Allen starts with this: what is Hillman College, which is the setting of the show? What's their history? And so she creates this kind of historical Bible. And I think that's the smartest thing. She points to the fact that it's a stop on the Underground Railroad, that its founder is an abolitionist. She gets right that it's predominantly women, and that reflects the kind of liberal arts college demographic of that time and even today. She gets sororities and fraternities right. She gets that she gets right, as she famously says, that they serve grits and fried apples and, collard greens in the cafeteria. And she writes all that out. And that works to situate the performers and the scriptwriters going forward on what context we're really talking about. I think the smartest thing she did was to remember that this was a college. And that meant also talking about what happens in the classroom.
The other thing she did, since we watch a show from beginning to end, is she changed the beginning. And so tell us about the pieces and very strategic development of this new introduction. Back when TV introductions were almost little art forms in and of themselves. And she did not miss this opportunity to really create some definition and to do a direct relation to the lives of these students.
So the original opening of A Different World is a little confusing in that first season under Anne Bates. And so the stars of the show, they're outdoors. There's Dwayne Wade, who is playing a piano on the back of an old truck that's held up by bales of hay. And you're saying, what? What does this have to do with college? Any college, certainly not at HBCU. And so there's Jaleesa's character who's jumping rope, and you're just not clear what's happening and what the setting is. And so in that way, it kind of signaled the directionlessness of the show. Debbie Allen comes in and she does this, which is still today so beloved, as we know from the ESPN parody of this opening, where she sets up this single camera flow through what is college life, and especially college life on a Black campus. And so you see each of the characters who are starting with kind of the matriculation all the way through graduation. And she takes us through this in such a visually stunning opening, the likes that we haven't seen before on television.
Mm-hmm. And the singer of the song, Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin replaces Phoebe Snow, who sang the original opening. And I think that's a powerful message. It's a powerful change message. Phoebe is a jazz singer. Aretha's voice is instantly recognizable. She's known for respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. And so she's the perfect person to mark what this new beginning of the show is going to be. Importance for the Black community viewing it or the white community viewing it, telling the story just in that little 30-second or however long that intro is, that ends with graduation. They're throwing up their caps in the air. How powerful was that for the viewers of all colors?
Yeah. We can speculate on how beloved it is. We know that it's still popular and capturing people's imaginations because they're remaking the opening. But there are some real markers that we can point to, and that is what we know today is that college enrollments across the board increased during Debbie Allen's time at the helm of A Different World. And particularly HBCU applications and enrollments. So applications and yield increased. I'm certainly a Different World era viewer, and that was a powerful motivator for me to apply to and attend college.
When you were applying to colleges, was Hillman your first choice?
Of course. I was accepted at Georgetown, and when I turned him down, my guidance counselor threw a hissy fit. She said she couldn't understand why a girl with so much to offer like myself would limit myself at a school like Hillman. That's what she told me.
It sounds familiar.
She didn't understand. My great-granddaddy was all but accepted at this certain Ivy League school until he showed up for the interview. He went to Hillman, and he went on to become the first Black circuit judge of Madison County, Virginia. He always told me, I was 7 years old. Baby, you can go to school any place, but no school will love you and teach you to love yourself and know yourself like Hillman.
In your capacity currently, then, as a professor for both undergraduate and graduate students, how much do you end up talking about A Different World? And is there much recognition from today's millennial that this was a show? Do they have any interest in it?
It's so funny that you ask. The Black Student Union here on campus, so they have annual events and performances, and they actually have two different kinds of T-shirts and sweatshirts. One that's very popular says Hillman College, which is the fictional college. And that has become the paraphernalia of students, particularly Black students. So you will see a Hillman College T-shirt as often as you will see University of Michigan or Harvard or Yale. And so some people, it looks like a real shirt. And so some people actually don't know that Hillman College is fictional when you're walking around. And then the other is that they have regularly done A Different World themes where they use the logo from the series to brand the discussion that they're going to have about, being a Black student or a student of color and how to navigate college successfully.
Wow.
So you'll see that on T-shirts, you'll see that on flyers. So A Different World resonates today.
87 is when it started, I think. Is, to your knowledge, wow, deep TV for 400, are you ready? Is this the only TV show, comedy or drama, ever set at an HBCU?
Ooh, good question. I'm going to say yes.
I think so.
I think it is. We have seen television series that have been set, for example, in predominantly black high schools, that kind of thing, or films, Cooley High.
Room 222 from the 60s. That was a great show. Very diverse. The White Shadow was a very diverse high school, and there aren't that many college setting shows, drama or comedy, that you can speak to.
So not on television, no, and obviously the obvious marker is School Days, which is in some ways gives birth to what we see in the Debbie Allen version of A Different World. Much of the cast, the starring cast, is from School Days. So you see Ron Johnson's character from School Days, you see Whitley's character from School Days, and a lot of the supporting cast members are being carried over from Spike Lee's School Days, which is set at HBCU, and you see them appear in A Different World.
And that was a film, though, correct?
That was a film.
We can really sort of see almost the DNA of the show as it evolved in the hands of writers and the first director, the first creative leader of it, and then ultimately once Debbie Allen got her hands on it. So we can also talk a little bit about how it is that she really transitioned the content to more of the important coming of age and social issues that just were not very present in the first season, but all of a sudden kind of became the hallmark. And by the time they hit their 5th and 6th season, the focus was just so much, it almost had that Norman Lear tone of, you know what, there's going to be a lesson in this somewhere, so pay attention, everybody.
Absolutely.
Is there any study about that? Have you ever heard her speak about why she felt it so important to get serious sooner?
Well, she talked a lot about social relevancy, and I think that the way to make sense of this is through contrast. And so Ann Bates has, for example, this episode called Porky de Bergerac, which is essentially that Denise leaves pizza out in the common room, and ants come in and get into the pizza, and so she has to wear a pig nose around campus. That was their kind of hard-hitting, in quotes, episode of the week, and it just didn't resonate. And in some ways, these were more childish episodes. You really couldn't tell the difference between it being in a college setting or a high school setting or even a junior high school setting, and we'd seen these storylines before. They were sort of cliched. And Debbie Allen was smarter than that, and she also knew that the challenges that students of color were facing on campuses in the real world had to be represented in A Different World. So A Different World emerges when there are some really difficult racial climate issues that's happening on our biggest campuses, including the University of Michigan.
And fundamentally, and really one of the the key point of this podcast episode is the idea that Ann, even if she had been her most masterful, Ann Bates probably could not have delivered the level of authenticity that Debbie did simply because she's white. And she was her ideas and the plots and the scripts were allowed to go forward because she certainly had the trust and the license. This was her job, and yet seemed as though nobody was really calling out the fact that it wasn't sophisticated and it wasn't terribly relevant. That's the core of representation. That's the definition of why it's so important in the statistics that we see weekly and monthly about the underrepresentation of writers of color, directors of color, camera people of color, anybody who is not from the almost white male school.
That's right. I mean, so Allen brings not only a person of color sensibility, an African American woman sensibility, but she is also bringing the sort of Black cultural sensibility to this as well. And that is something that is unique and it is specific. And she remedies those moments where you're watching television, a commercial or a show, and you say, wow, clearly nobody of fill in the blank. No woman was in the room, no person of color was in the room, because I'm sure someone would have said, ooh, this is a bad idea. So not only does she remedy that situation, but she is really quite talented. And she brings her experiences to bear, and you see a different world really offering an authentic reflection of what happens on historically black colleges and university campuses.
So even that particular experience that's then is translated, she walks into what is a replication of her own personal experience. And had she been a graduate of this fine institution, the University of Michigan, she would have had to probably stretch herself a little bit, and she may have not walked into the role with nearly the appreciation for the culture that really had been steeped in her own education.
I think so. I think that's fair. Certainly she would have brought a black cultural experience to the show, which was not there in the writing and the directing and producing of A Different World under Ann Bates. But the other thing, I think the person where you really see how smart, how creative, how in tune she is the introduction of the character Mr. Gaines, who is so much more than someone who just runs the cafe on campus.
Yeah, he's not Al from Happy Days.
Exactly. That's right. Great analogy and contrast. I mean, he is a mentor. He is he's in some ways a spiritual guide, sort of a North Star. He has a military background and understands how to support those who are going through ROTC. What is important about Mr. Gaines is that he's cast as a central figure in these students' lives. And that is something that you really do need to be on these campuses to understand that it isn't always just the faculty, it isn't always just sort of the academic administrators, but it's really kind of a family orientation where the campus as a whole is working to really lift these students up and support them. And I think Mr. Gaines is a perfect example of the nuances, the nuanced difference between simply writing about a University of Michigan or a Northwestern University and writing about an HBCU.
Excellent. And so let's talk a little bit about the cast, because Mr. Gaines was a key addition. Let's talk in particular about the young women, because she was, Debbie Allen inherited a few of them, and then she filled out a few others by virtue of Lisa Bonet's pregnancy and Marissa Tomei wanting to leave, I think. Is that how that worked?
So quite the contrary. Marissa Tomei.
Did she put up a fuss?
So Marissa Tomei, it isn't that she goes out fighting, but she certainly goes out unhappy. And Marissa Tomei's character, Maggie, is at an HBCU, and Debbie Allen really thought, okay, we have a white character who's at a historically black college, and regardless of race, at colleges, folks develop friendships, they date, they go to each other's homes over holiday breaks, and so it would have been weird for Maggie to not have developed any relationships. So one of the things that Debbie Allen wanted to explore was if Maggie went home with Dwayne Wade over the Christmas break, for example, and there was a sort of guess who's coming to dinner moment. And the network was having none of it. They thought that it was too controversial to have an interracial relationship depicted, and actually was concerned about Marissa Tomei's role as Maggie throughout the season or throughout the series, and whether she should be depicted as having a close relationship with black folks. And so they actually removed her from the series. And according to Debbie Allen, Marissa Tomei is heartbroken about this. She's very upset, and not just sort of emotionally sad, but really quite angry, and leaves the show just devastated and in tears. Fortunately, Debbie Allen is a few years later, able to actually do her interracial dating episode with Kim dating Freddie's cousin, Matthew, and Matthew's a student at Emory, a neighboring college, and so she
With
does
Freddie
get
being
in.
biracial.
Exactly, and so Matthew is white, and Kim is black.
And do you suppose that that Debbie Allen strategically played a card by having the black that it was a black woman with a white man versus a white woman with a black man?
I think so,
That
and
there's a sensitivity in there that's very subtle.
absolutely, absolutely. I think you're really onto something there, Cynthia. And then the other thing that it does is that it aligns nicely with where we started with Debbie Allen's Bible for the show, where she describes a sort of 3-to-1 gender balance on the Hillman campus. And so Kim is also a starring character. She's a woman. And so that matchup was sort of likely.
Sure. By having this student be from someplace else, you knew it was a short. It was going to be perhaps 1 or 2 episodes,
Exactly.
and it would probably fizzle out. And then, Marissa Tomei went on to My Cousin Vinny, which was sort of her breakout, but she did 22 episodes with A Different World. Interesting. I bet she still has observations that she would like to share when she writes her memoir. So let's talk a little bit about these female characters, because they were important if you really want to break down the impressions and the representation that they served to young men and women of every color. I mean, they held some incredible standards, and they performed absolutely. I mean, this is some of the best TV you're ever going to see. So let's talk about these actresses and the characters themselves. Of course, you have to start off with Whitley Gilbert, played by Jasmine Guy, who it feels as though really has walked in Debbie Allen's. I mean, she has been half a step behind and absolutely celebrating and keeping some of those traditions alive. So the Whitley character, where do you come from with that, and how do you teach it?
So Whitley starts off under Ann Bates as just largely sort of a narcissist. And what I do like about what Debbie Allen does with Whitley is she gives her much more complexity. And so we learn more about her relationships with her parents, which in some ways are strained and a little bit difficult. We learn more about her dating relationships. So she's not just, she's not filling the quote unquote dumb blonde role as a black woman, but she's really quite smart. There are moments when she emerges as a true leader. In one of the more powerful episodes. So when I teach Whitley, I often teach the episode where she goes into a department store and she encounters what she believes is what we would call today a microaggression or racism, where a jewelry store sales associate does not want to show her expensive jewelry. And Whitley decides to sort of buy out the store in a sort of a way. She buys things, a few items that are just really outside of her price range, to sort of teach this woman a lesson that she's able to afford it, that she's worthy and responsible. And in fact, she really wasn't able to afford it. She is a college student. But it does show her depth. That we aren't all one thing all the time. And so it breaks her out of a mold, a sort of cliched mold, that she's just sort of the beauty queen or the princess.
I think Whitley, for anybody who watched the show when it first aired and then watched it again when it was on in syndication throughout the 90s, if you look at it again today, you still see this breakout from privilege. That even it was recognized that she had privilege, and it took her a little bit of time, but that became the button that she pushed very effectively. And let's talk a little bit then about the buttons that the Freddie Brookses of the world, the Cree Summer, what she pushed, and what the plots that revolved around her. What was Debbie Allen trying to do with those plots?
So I really do like how Debbie Allen is showing a depth of diversity within blackness. And it isn't just that Freddie carries this because she's biracial, but Debbie is doing a really great job of showing how all of these characters from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different relationships to education and moving through the system, that there's such a huge diversity within Blackness. And so Freddie comes from New Mexico. She is biracial. And so there is a little bit of stereotyping there where Freddie is this sort of, and I think the stereotyping is interesting because I actually think it speaks more to Debbie Allen's stereotype about folks who come from New Mexico than being multiracial. So she's a free spirit. You learn more about her mother, who doesn't always give her solid direction, that they are more friends than mother and daughter. And so Freddie is kind of a hippie wild child, and she comes into this environment, but it also means that Freddie's asking really interesting and tough questions. She's asking questions around the purpose of war or violence. She's challenging stereotypes. She is the character who is central to a really important episode about sexual assault. So Freddie is at times strong and other times vulnerable. And so that's what I think is really great about what Debbie Allen does. Freddie and Whitley together seem to be such a contrast, but if you look at some of the most famous episodes of A Different World, they are coming together. She brings these two characters together who seem to be so different, this sort of debutante princess and this, quite literally this wild child. And it's through their dialogue that some of the most difficult questions are probed and dealt with on the series.
So they present a certain dichotomy that then ultimately, occasionally, becomes complementary when the talk gets toughest. So, and that's a very delicate balance to navigate in a comedy. And here were actors and actresses who were certainly under the age of 30. They weren't necessarily the true age, but they were relatively unknown when they came in. If they had been known on Broadway, perhaps, or in Spike Lee's film, that was certainly one point on their resume. But it's not as though they had come out of even the Cosby Show as Lisa Bonet had. So let's go on then to Charnel Brown, who played the Kimberly Reese character. What did that character bring to all of these plot lines?
She is just one of my favorite characters. So Kimberly Reese comes from a sort of solidly working class household, working class, sort of middle class household. Hardworking. Her father is a police officer, and in another powerful episode we see that he is shot while on duty, and she has to deal with that. But she is a student who things have not come easy. She is a hard worker, so you see her balancing a number of jobs. She's working in the cafeteria alongside Mr. Gaines, and she's smart, and she's a striver, and she's going to be somebody.
She's going to be a physician.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. So she is pre-med here at Hillman. And I think she strikes a really nice balance between the extremes of a Whitley and a Freddie. She's the voice of reason. She is sensible. She is mature. And I think in some ways she rounds out Jaleesa in a nice way. She's super studious and also is the one in difficult or poignant or important episodes is the one who reminds that there's yet like sort of a third perspective. So there's the Whitley approach, the Freddie approach, and then there's something else to be considered. What Debbie Allen does, what I like what she does in the show, is that she doesn't work to reconcile all of those positions, but what she says is she puts them all on the table so that we can find ourselves in one of these women. It's a stunningly strong feminist episode where women are not only teaching women and being inspirational to women, but as you said, to everyone. And so they are the leaders. They're the intellectual leaders on the show. They are the leaders of difficult social problems. Yeah, and they're just really smart.
And there's 4 of them, and there's really only 2 principal male students who are part of the group. And so that rounds us out to Jaleesa Vinson, played by Dawn Lewis, and she is not quite non-traditional. Is she supposed to have graduated? Is she technically
She's supposed
not
to be a non-traditional age student. So she is supposed to be someone who had a life, had a family, was married, and is coming back to school. And that isn't unusual for liberal arts colleges. Even my own undergraduate experience, I went to a women's college, and we had a program called the Gateway Program, where non-traditional age students, adult women, would come back to either start or complete a degree. And so Jaleesa looked very familiar to me. She was the non-traditional age students that I went to school with. So she felt very familiar. She was bringing a maturity and expertise, and at the same time, Jaleesa also learned a lot from her traditional age peers who had come essentially right out of high school. Through life experience, she was bringing reason and
not quite a maternal sensibility, but a sensibility that does come from a college campus when there is somebody with a little more life experience. So it didn't turn into a Lucie and Ethel sort of just crazy.
Correct.
And you had a couple years difference where if they were difficult conversations, Jaleesa sometimes presented yet a fourth.
Yes,
a fourth voice.
Yeah.
And one question that I'm going to ask, and it's not on our list of prearranged questions, but I always think it's important in the discussion of higher education, the richness of a college campus that is peppered with first generation to attend college from their family, and that family experience and the family support and the family expectation and how that comes across in behavior versus a Whitley who it was very clear her family they gave the money for one of the buildings.
Dorms, right.
So she is certainly the second, if not third or fourth generation to attend. So of the breakout of these four main characters, Whitley is at least a second generation.
Right.
Freddie Brooks first?
Perhaps. I don't know. We see, yes, she could be first gen.
And of modest means. Yep. Kimberly Reese, presumably first generation, perhaps her mother had attended something, but again of modest means. Jaleesa of modest means, quite likely first generation to attend. And then of the young men, Ron Johnson and Dwayne, they both come from modest means.
Right, because Ron's father was a car salesman, and Dwayne's mother is the famous Patti LaBelle. And her chipmunk, we assume. I don't recall that that's dealt with, but I believe he may also be first gen.
So, and that was not unusual in the late 80s. That was very common in both white campuses as well as the HBCUs.
And then, unfortunately, what we know in the real world is that continues. First generation students are students that we continue to hope to attract. There are still a number of Pell Grant eligible first gen students out there, and certainly first gen immigrant students. And so our college campuses still are inviting those students. And we want to see more representation.
Well, I was alumni director at my alma mater for a couple of years and also responsible for overseeing commencement exercises, which is that's a craft in and of itself. But what I will say from having observed, about a dozen or so, probably more than a dozen commencements, is the incredible pride that still exists when that first generation graduates, and the kind of turnout of extended family that it is in fact a sacrifice and a celebration that everybody in those pictures knows exactly what has happened to get them to the point of being able to throw their mortarboard up in the air, and it sends chills up my spine when I think about it, because it was just, that's what made that job. Okay, before we get off of the category of these great women performers, you mentioned Patti LaBelle as Dwayne's mother and Diane Carroll as played Whitley's mother.
Yes.
And Diane Carroll, who pops up in all the right places.
Yep.
What do you suppose they were thinking? I mean, there had to have been a very interesting supply of women of that age who could have stepped in. Do you have any background on how it is that these two came into being, and whether or not did black audiences know who they were more so than white audiences? I mean, if it was an 18-year-old kid watching the sitcom.
So to have Patti LaBelle, so certainly viewers, especially young black viewers, know who Patti LaBelle is. Mm-hmm. And that's really exciting. And then, you sort of watch and say, is there going to be an episode where she sings? She's going to sing, right? She's going to sing. So Patti LaBelle is certainly recognizable. Diane Carroll's character would be known to young people as well watching at that time. Diane Carroll had a significant resume,
yes, she
but
did.
Was really well known in Claudine and a cult classic film, The Five Heartbeats. She had been on Dynasty.
Yeah, I was just doing the Dynasty look. 84 to 87.
Yeah.
So she had rolled right off of that.
Yes. And having Diane Carroll on Dynasty is a really big deal. It brought black audiences to Dynasty.
Yes.
And importantly, she is, right, because the 80s were just bad for black representations. And there was all of this, the CBS reports, the vanishing black family, and it was all about black dysfunction. And there were all of these documentaries and news interviews about welfare queens and black men who were absentee fathers and just all of this. And so then you have Diane Carroll on Dynasty, and she's feisty and gorgeous and glamorous and rich, and she's putting Joan Collins in her place, and she's fabulous. Oh, trust and believe. Viewers
and in her memoir, she maintains she and a friend were watching Dynasty one evening and said, "My goodness, isn't this a white show?" And the friend said, "Well," and so she picks up the phone, leaves a voicemail or calls Aaron Spelling, and basically says, "Honey, you got problems here." And he said, "Well, then come on in and read for something." So she created the role herself, and I've tried to hunt her down to get that interview. And we could talk about Julia, but we don't have to talk about Julia. I want to talk about that Dynasty thing because that was something special, and that was the result of one person picking up the phone and saying, "This needs to be better."
Yeah, and
just like Felicia Rashad did when she walked on the set.
That's right. But it isn't just that, it is Diane Carroll. It's not just anybody. It's not Robert Coleman who's calling Aaron Spelling saying, "Ooh, you got a problem." And no, but it's Diane Carroll, and she really does have the performance pedigree,
yes. and the stature.
Yeah. She is gorgeous, and she's bringing that to Dynasty, and there's nobody else I can imagine in that role. So that's a real natural transfer then for her to be the very well-heeled mother of Whitley Gilbert. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Patti LaBelle was Patti LaBelle. Yeah, it could have been Gladys Knight. It could have been somebody else, and
Gladys Knight appears on the show,
and Lena Horne does, and the list is.
Those elder performers are really important. Rosalind Cash is on the show. Cornbread Earl and Me kind of fame. Mary Alice, who's done a number of roles, but my favorite is actually her. There's two. Her turn in Sparkle as the mother, and then she had a breakout role. I think she was nominated for an Emmy for it on Law and Order, which is just one of the most incredible performances that I have seen. She was in The Matrix, and so anyway, that's after A Different World. But there's some real star power that comes to the series.
And Tupac was in it, and
Jada Pinkett Smith.
Yes. All right, so let's just round out this conversation about A Different World, because sadly, as much as we could gush on this show, and we could for hours actually, it was never really nominated for a performing Emmy, and it had 3 nominations for almost technical.
Yeah.
Almost technical.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Have you, in all of your reading, has anybody had an observation, someone who is closer to the show? Was there any explanation?
Not that I know of, about, these are these roles where it's just such a loss. It's such a disappointment. So if you look back at some of the shows that won, that just don't have the longevity, that aren't, you could really just take A Different World and put it on the air today, and it would work. I mean, you wouldn't even have to do a kind of reboot like they're doing with Will and Grace, like they're doing with Roseanne. You don't even need to do that. You could just put it on today and people would watch it and it would be popular. So I don't know why, but what I will say is that, in thinking about situation comedies that focus on Black life and culture, with the exception of The Cosby Show during that time, they weren't getting mainstream acclaim. They weren't getting the Emmys as much. The Cosby Show got something. Bernie Mac, his show, The Bernie Mac Show, got something. Most recently, Atlanta, Donald Glover's show picked up an Emmy. But on the whole,
and you had those UPN shows, but those were considered second class. Whether they
totally were.
Yeah, they really were.
They were, sort of exploiting not even the Black audience. What they were doing, UPN, and WB, the upstart networks, were offering up really inexpensive programming. So not investing in writers, not investing in producers, not investing in sets or anything like that, but just doing these Black sitcoms on the cheap. It was attracting the target audience initially that they wanted, which was kind of that preteen, teenage, actually white male, right? So these were kids who were, thinking that they were going to get glimpses of hip-hop culture in these sitcoms. They got them they got them kind of hooked on the network, and then they canceled the shows and switched. Sitcoms, Black sitcoms in particular, were used as a vehicle to actually attract white audiences, young white audiences, to the network, but there wasn't a real commitment to those shows.
It was more window dressing, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So you were just mentioning that it could be that A Different World could be rebooted today without too much more than putting phones in these young people's hands, because I think at one point there was a reference to a pager, but that was it.
And payphones all over campus.
Yeah, they did. And yet now on Blackish, we have the daughter who is about to have her own spin-off.
Yeah.
And do you feel your Different World antenna sort of popping up a little bit?
It'll be interesting to see what they do with her. I believe that she is going to a PWI, a predominantly white institution. I'm not sure. So they certainly, I am certain that they are aware of the incredible legacy of A Different World. And I know they're aware. They make references to The Cosby Show, to A Different World, in overt and subtle ways on Blackish. So they've got some big shoes to fill. We'll see how they do that. But I also hear that there may be talk of bringing some form of A Different World back, and I'm really hopeful that's the case.
So with regard to where these performers are today, Dawn Lewis has appeared in a few things. Cree Summer continues to do actually a lot of voice work. Yeah. Jasmine Guy has had a very, I saw her on Broadway in Chicago and saw her again on a touring performance of entertainment from the 20s. So the Harlem-based, the golden age of Harlem performance and the sound, so from the 1910s and the 1920s. And she is such a dancer, and she is such a student of Debbie Allen that I feel as though she's got projects going on. And Charnel Brown is actually in Texas and leads some sort of a small theater down there. So they are, I think they're just waiting. They're waiting for more opportunity, and I am hopeful that there's a lot of connection there.
Dwayne is still performing. Ron is still performing. So they all did well after the series. I think the interesting thing will be, or I think there's an interesting contrast between A Different World and Blackish. And what A Different World does is that though it's instructive, it doesn't do the sort of, we are going to teach you Black culture, sort of Black culture 101. And Blackish does do that. Blackish has these segments within the episode where they do definitions. They put definitions on the screen and, do the definitional work and say, here's the history and we're going to explain it to you. A Different World didn't do that. It said, you meet us where we are. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a difference. And so we'll see what happens with the spinoff.
I can't thank you enough for this tremendous conversation. We really could talk all afternoon, but we've got other things to do. So didn't I tell you this would be fun? I am so grateful to Dr. Robin Means Coleman, who not only promptly and enthusiastically agreed to my request for an interview, but sat at her desk today loaded with notes and reference points that she wanted to make. This woman brings her A game. I left the interview realizing that there were indeed a few questions that you may have from our discussions that should not be left unanswered. Because, you know what, I had them too. So here's one. If A Different World didn't win any Emmys, or at least not the big ones, who did? For comedy and actresses leading in a comedy series, here's what we have. And from 1988 to 1993, let me just tell you, it was some pretty hefty competition. For the shows, The Wonder Years, Cheers, Murphy Brown, and Seinfeld. Oh, and yeah, that was really solid TV comedy, albeit not a black or otherwise diverse lead character in the entire mix. And that says something. Leading actress in a comedy series, again, what a list. Bea Arthur, Kirstie Alley, Candice Bergen, and Roseanne Barr. These were women who were at very different stages in their careers than any of the actresses that were on A Different World. And then there was that whole thing that Dr. Coleman talked about with regard to HBCU applications and enrollments, and how during the years that A Different World was on, that there was actually measurable growth going on in regard to applications and enrollments. So I just thought, okay, it's worth doing a little fact checking. In this age of fake news, we have to make sure that, and not that this woman doesn't absolutely know her stuff, but I thought best I have a place to send people to. So lo and behold, I found this great article written by Jamal Eric Watson. And it's entitled, A Different World Still Pulls Fans into the HBCU Experience, written August 18th, 2016, published online by an organization or publication called Diverse New Views in Education. So basically, it purports that from the debut of The Cosby Show in 1988 until the end of A Different World in 1993, with almost a decade, American higher education grew by 16.8%. And during that same period, HBCUs grew by 24.3%. Now, you could probably point to some points of the economy and just the expansion of higher education during the 80s and early 90s. However, the HBCU activity, probably there is, that gives you enough room to draw that direct correlation. And so I'm going to then quote another element within this article, because this is all important and it supports what Dr. Coleman was telling us. This spike in enrollment at HBCUs isn't a coincidence, says Dr. Mary Beth Gasman, director of the Center for Minority Serving Institutions at the University of Pennsylvania and an expert on HBCUs. So I'm quoting Dr. Gasman, who is quoted in this great article written by Jamal Eric Watson. Quote, A Different World brought HBCUs into the mainstream and presented them in very positive ways on a regular basis, says Gasman, who is also a professor of higher ed in Penn's Graduate School of Education. Quote, The show was made with care and demonstrated the ethos of HBCUs. Viewers got a chance to see the diversity among African Americans, end quote. So this isn't Hollywood hype. This is higher ed providing cause and effect data about the importance of representation. Remember when Dr. Coleman talked about the origin of characters like Whitley and Dwayne? That they came from School Days, a movie from 1988, Spike Lee's musical comedy that starred Lawrence Fishburne, and it centered on a fraternity and a sorority at an HBCU and delved into nuances of Black culture. School Days. It's not one you'll find on the Hallmark Channel, but scour your streaming services and you're sure to find it. 1988. that's when it was actually released. So the fact that it contained actors and actresses who then ultimately ended up in a different world, you can kind of see that, given that film production is a couple of years usually, it was a really quick transition for those actors. But you can find A Different World on cable. I just caught it recently on the One channel on my cable system. And if you're interested in more of these really thoughtful approaches, like we explored today with Robin Means Coleman about the Black experience in TV, then check out this gem from your library. And it's the one that contains Dr. Coleman's essay, Watching While Black, Centering the Television of Black Audiences. And this book was written in 2012, edited by Beretta Smith Shamad. And if you can't get enough of me gushing about Debbie Allen, go to an early episode of Advanced TV Herstory entitled Debbie Allen, Early Career Fame TV Series. And I'll give you fair warning right now, it sounds like an early episode of something that has become polished and well-produced, your favorite podcast. The podcasting learning curve, I will just say, particularly early on, is steep. But in light of what you know now about Debbie Allen's impact on American life, not just TV, on American life, her early career is a fascinating story. Speaking of well-produced, as always, a big thank you to David Brown, our audio technician. The music featured in the introduction was Take Me Higher by Jazar, found at Free Music Archive. We do love our Free Music Archive. Subscribe to this podcast on Google Play, Apple Podcast, and Auto Radio, and Radio Public. Play it directly on FM Player or our podcast website, www.tvherstory.com. Your recommendations mean the world to me, and also helping someone, a new listener, master the easiest way for them to listen. Well, let's just say that I consider that to be the highest compliment. Our Twitter handle is @TVHerstory. Our email, advancedtvherstory@gmail.com. Shoot us a note. It's never been more important for women and girls to see themselves on TV, all colors, shapes, and interests that we experience in our lives. The only way this will happen is for women to reclaim our status. We need to band together to educate, celebrate, and fortify one another. Be part of this important conversation. This is Why I Podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.